Today I'm speaking with Dr. Keven James Rudrow from Syracuse University. And if you have ever wondered about the research behind how stories bring us together, you are not going to want to miss today's episode. If you're ready to get your story out in the world, but you've just been waiting as you're not sure whether the budget's going to fit or the timeline or the support, I get it. Every author is different. Every book is different. And that is why in December, we are rolling out 3 different tiers of service. You are not going to want to miss this announcement when we open to the general public. And if you want to be the first to hear, head to the link in the show notes, take the book strategy quiz. Once you do that, you're going to get a ton of helpful information now, and you're going to be the first to hear when we make these new tiers of service available. I can't wait, and I can't wait to hear about your book. Well, welcome to our show, Dr. Rudrow. I'm so excited to hear more about the work you have been up to. And obviously, I've worked with you before. Do we have 2 publications together?
Yes, 2.
Yes. So obviously, I know a little something about it, but I'm really excited to share with everybody else that watches the show. So do you want to start by just telling us a little bit about who you are, what you do, what your interests are?
Right. So my name is Keven James Rudrow. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Rhetorical Studies at Syracuse University. I'm also affiliated faculty in the LGBTQ studies. And so oftentimes that has meant focusing specifically on the ways in which ideas of masculinity, racialized masculinity, gets represented, particularly in terms of Black men. And so I focused a lot in my work on popular music, for instance, so hip hop music, other forms of media that's representing the lives, the experiences, the knowledges of Black men as they navigate the world around them. So that's a little bit about who I am and the work that I do.
Well, yeah, and I love how you pull this theme of stories through all of that, because all of the formats of popular culture really are story-based. So as you kind of thought about how these stories impact other people, is there, a particular compelling reason that makes stories so powerful?
Right. Yeah, so a lot of these stories are powerful precisely because they're stories that are very powerful, they're very salient. We feel them individually. And oftentimes we don't realize that other individuals too have had a very similar experience, similar stories, similar narratives, experiences, and things like that. And so one of the things that I think is profound about merely sharing a story is other people acknowledge those stories and say, look, that's an experience that I have as well. Right. And there's something powerful about being able to mobilize and unite.
Maybe I hear a story and it makes me feel a little bit less alone because, especially some of your researches are stories that people haven't told yet. You have that great article coming out on how YouTube coming out stories are so powerful for queer youth.
Right.
Because maybe you haven't shared that story with anybody. Having access to somebody else's can really help, right?
Right. And, I think that's important to remember. Certain stories are more shareable, for various different reasons. Maybe it's because of an individual's sense of insecurity, but that insecurity exists, right? In part because there are all these social factors that say that you should be insecure, right? You should not feel comfortable sharing that particular story. So you can share this story, right? But then there are other sorts of stories though that seem to be a little bit more taboo, right? So the coming out narrative, for instance, coming out stories, those stories have oftentimes been part of our knowledge, right? Those stories have oftentimes existed as part of this archive, right? But not so much in a larger public eye, really. And that's why sites like YouTube, for instance, became really popular with the It Gets Better campaign, because it became a way for individuals who oftentimes didn't see coming out narratives, or at least see themselves represented in those coming out narratives in mainstream television and film, just to create their own stories and to tell their own stories, because societally those stories that have a narrative that conflict with what the dominant norm is supposed to be around sexuality are not really supposed to be told in favor of the ones that help to solidify and cement ideologies around sex, sexuality, such as the coming of age, young boys to become men through sexually conquering the bodies of women, for instance.
Well, I love that the way that you're kind of putting that into two buckets, that on one hand, there are these stories that, oh yeah, tell that. Everyone tells that. Truly, even if it harms other people, even if it, alienates people or isolates people. And then there's these stories that we're not supposed to tell. And I think about when you are not supposed to tell your story, the shame that comes with
Right.
that. Who
Mm-hmm.
you are is you can't share that. You have to make some different story up, or whatever, to be accepted. So it's incredibly vulnerable in that case.
Right.
Then you put those things out there, even though you've been told your whole entire life, never tell that story. So what is that role? How do people kind of build up that vulnerability, and how does that help cement a connection between the storyteller and the listener?
Right. Yeah. I think that can be very challenging, for lots of reasons. For me, I think the ability to be vulnerable is actually a resistive act, especially in a society in which we're not necessarily supposed to be vulnerable because it's sort of, especially if you're, Black men, for instance, vulnerability can be a very challenging to express because, and also probably men in general as well, because vulnerability hasn't necessarily been a part of how we think about masculinity. And so I think there's something resistive about being vulnerable and being able to tell those stories that emerge from a place of vulnerability. And so I think one thing that could be very helpful for individuals who might struggle to share certain narratives, especially narratives that might cast themselves in a more vulnerable light, is to remember that there's something resistive about that. And this goes back to what you and I were saying earlier about the ways in which many of us are connected through common experiences and common stories, but more importantly, common vulnerabilities, right? Common vulnerabilities that we've all experienced, and that now we have narratives or stories about those things that we can share with one another and feel connected. But I think this comes back to accepting that there can be something very resistive, freeing almost, about embracing vulnerability and putting words and telling stories around those vulnerabilities.
There are a lot of reasons that people don't want to share their true background. Like, I will see this all the time with leaders who it feels really, really vulnerable to say, hey, I actually wasn't always that great at this. I didn't always know what I was supposed to say. I didn't always know what I was supposed to write. Do you have thoughts on kind of how do you get over that psychological barrier that is keeping us from doing all of this good for others and keeping us from really validating ourselves and affirming who we are?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think for me, it has a lot to do with just ultimately stopping and asking why it is that you do, why it is that we do what it is that we do, right? And so, if we're doing it because we're invested in helping individuals through through the books, through the stories, through the articles, through the book chapters, or whatever it is that we're writing, YouTube videos, whatever it is that we're creating, then I think we need to acknowledge that an important part of helping individuals includes, right, the ability to tell our stories while also encouraging other individuals to be able to tell their stories. I think that's part of creating a better society. But like I said before, those things aren't necessarily easy to do, right? It can be very challenging. And so, I think the best that many of us can do, because it is so challenging, is to just sort of be open to sort of like regularly work on ourselves, and then just to remind ourselves of what that ultimate goal is, right? And I think that is to, for me anyway, it's to be helpful in whatever ways I can, even if they're small. Oftentimes, they are in small ways, but still, I think that it's still significant, right?
I
It can
agree.
still have an important impact on somebody.
Yeah. And actually, as you were, I had not thought about this before, but as you were talking, a big part of embracing that bravery to be vulnerable is accepting that you are an actual leader, that
Right.
people are looking to you
Yeah.
to tell your story. And if you don't, you have kind of let them down. And so if you really have said, I am going to be a leader, I want to fight for change, I want to be part of this resistant community, there are really good reasons that you might not want to share your story,
Right.
but there are also really good reasons to do that internal work so that you do feel that you can step out safely and lead other people.
Right. Yeah, and I think sometimes people might have fear that their narrative, their story may not be like the narrative or the story that people might expect, for instance. It's like, well, what is a leader supposed to sound like, and how does my story sound like that? And I think for maybe some individuals, like, well, maybe my background doesn't speak to this sort of archetypical notion of leadership, and so my story shouldn't be shared. But I think the opposite is true, because there are certainly multiple different ways to think about leadership. For instance, there's multiple different ways to think about an individual's background and how that background carries them to whatever role that they're currently in. Um, and so, I think it becomes really important then to share one's experiences. And I think that also includes like the failure, because I think for a lot of individuals, people don't want to tell their story because if they were to do so in an ethical way, it would include failure. And leaders aren't supposed to fail, right? That's what we are told. In actuality, everybody fails. It's part of growing, it's part of being successful, it's part of learning. And stories help to facilitate that as well, right? So we learn through other people's stories of failure, and vice versa. And so I think they can be really powerful, even though oftentimes individuals that need to share those stories, oftentimes their leaders may be hesitant to do so for all the reasons we were talking about earlier about why individuals don't want to be read in a vulnerable light, despite how that vulnerability can oftentimes work in a way that can bring people together, you know?
Right. Well, right. And if we just go on with the assumption that all leaders' stories are supposed to sound this particular way, then we really also are giving into this idea that there are only particular communities that matter.
Right.
Because we can't ever uplift different types of stories, people of different backgrounds, people of different experiences, people whose failures don't look maybe the way we think they should, then we never have the opportunity to call out to the people in the community with those same backgrounds and experiences who maybe would be the next leader. So it is a profound thing to do, to come forward and say, I don't care whether society likes my story, I'm going to tell it anyway. How do you see some of these examples that some of these are very lighthearted examples, some of them are much heavier? How do you see these examples of stories actually bringing people together and actually forming different kinds of communities?
Yeah, and so this is something that is something I think a lot about, and something that I really try to emphasize in um, a lot of the classes that I teach. But one class in particular, and so at Syracuse University, I teach a class called um, hip hop cultures. And so one of the things about hip hop that is I think that speaks to all the things that we've been speaking to, is that hip hop is a genre of Black expression that hinges heavily on the art of storytelling. And that's not to say that every rapper is a great storyteller, but the genre has heavily emphasized storytelling. And so one of the things that the students share often in that class is the ways in which they sort of find their favorite artist or their favorite rapper because of a story. Usually it's some sort of autobiographical album or song, and there's something about that individual's background, their story, that a particular student might just relate to. So it's like it's fascinating to think about how we find community between ourselves, but then also we find community through the narratives that the stories that get told through the media that we consume, and so that's really important, because that's not just functioning on a individual level, interpersonal level. That's functioning on a national, if not transnational sort of level. The ways in which an artist can appeal to audiences, across demographics and things like that, just by sharing some things about themselves and having those things be very similar to the ways in which other people, all of us, have also sort of grew up, and similar things to things a lot of people commonly experience.
Well, maybe from that class sounds great, by the way. Maybe from that class or your research, or I even would be curious of your personal experience. Have you seen the transformative power of storytelling through some of these forms?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, so I think in recent years, and I think this is the case for a lot of um, Black people in academia. Um, it can be challenging because of the whiteness of academia, right? It's a very white space. Um, and so I think one of the ways in which, so this isn't a pop culture reference, but I think one of the things that's been really impactful for me recently has been just being in sort of close proximity to individuals, hearing their stories about the ways in which, so these are other Black academics and researchers and teachers, talking about the different ways in which that they have encountered structural racism and just different issues in the departments, and realizing like, okay, wait a second, other people experience those things in their departments too. So it's not just me, right? So like, I mean, that has been really important, right? Because it's like, I think for a lot of us, I think these are just minoritized people in academia in general, right? Like we gaslight ourselves into being like, maybe I didn't experience that, or maybe that person was just having a bad day, or maybe that didn't happen, or maybe, like we are really great at gaslighting ourselves. And so being able to talk to other individuals about the sorts of things that they experience in their departments, and realizing, wait a second, this is actually, this is a systemic thing that other people encounter, I think has been really important in terms of finding a sense of community, but then also realizing it's not me. This is just an issue that happens in the academy. And I think that example can also be sort of broadened to think about the ways in which we engage pop culture as well. Television and film. I can think of a lot of recent examples of TV that certainly have spoken to me in ways, and oftentimes in ways in which that other forms of media haven't spoken to me. So, I mean, I think the film Moonlight, for instance, is a good example. And I think some folks, as you recall from the research that we did on Moonlight, really liked Moonlight in part because it encompassed a lot of the things that they had seen, saw, felt, but had not ever seen represented on a larger scale like that, right? And so that's not an interpersonal conversation between two people. That's just a narrative. And I say just, but I don't mean just in a way to reduce its importance, because it's important. But that's a film, right? That's a narrative in a film that even still, right, is speaking to a lot of individuals because somebody was brave and vulnerable, right, and wrote and then created a film that represents a lots of things that a lot of people can relate to and have experienced, but that for whatever reason we don't really see represented in the mainstream media because, well, that's one of those stories that's not supposed to get told, or at
Yeah.
least not in a way, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's 100% true. And I love what you said. I hate what you said, but I love what you said about this gaslighting, this thing where it's like, well, maybe it's just me, or you don't have the words that you need to express what you're going through, and so then how can you even make it concrete in your own mind?
Right.
But other people who have been through it and who have thought about it and reflected and had their own mentors, they can come in and give you the words that you need. And how powerful.
Right. Right. What was it? Not too recently, I think it was Black in the Ivory. It was a trending hashtag on Twitter, which was about essentially Black academics explaining or talking about different experiences about what it's like to be Black in the academy. And I think that was a really eye-opening moment. I think in a lot of ways it demonstrated things that we all know, we've all kind of felt, right? I mean, but to see that so many people are experiencing those things on such a massive level, I mean, I think that speaks to the power, right, of telling one story.
I agree. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
There you have it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Keven James Rudrow as much as I did. I think he has an amazing perspective on what it means to step forward, embrace your power, and tell your story to help others. And if that's something that's been on your mind, it's always on my mind, you are not going to want to miss these 3 new tiers of service that we're offering at Page and Podium Press. Stay tuned to hear a little bit more about the new opportunities we're dropping in December. I am on a mission to make sure that everyone has access to the support and tools that they need to tell their story and tell their story well. And that is why I am so excited to roll out 2 brand new offers that are going to fit so much more comfortably into a whole range of budgets. Now, the first one I can't share with you quite yet, but if you are looking for a community of support and skills and tips and all of the things you need to move your memoir forward, keep an eye on this channel. But the one I want to tell you about today is the Change Maker package. This is a brand new package we're offering that is going to give you all of that ghostwriting, all of that editing support that you want, all of the help to get your story on the page, even if you're just not a writer. So that package is only available to our newsletter subscribers right now, but if you want to be the first to hear when we open it to the general public, I hope you'll head over to the link in our show notes and take the book strategy quiz today. That's going to help make sure that you get all of the information you need about what the path your book should be on and how to sign up to have us help you get it out into the world. I know that you are ready for this and you deserve to have your story out there. So sign up for that quiz right now. The link is in the show notes and I can't wait to hear about your story.